All right, so let's get started on today's class. So typically what we would do is we're starting a new chapter. We would typically have our pre-test today, but it is the day after an exam, and I don't want to be a monster. So we are going to have a pre-test on chapter 4, but it'll be next class just to give you time to focus on the exam and then, time to read chapter 4. But we do have to move along, so we are going to start up chapter 4 today. And we're going to take a look at classical conditioning. We introduced that in chapter 3. But now we're going to take a look at some of the basic phenomena and also some of the complexities that occur in classical conditioning. So we have the basic format, but now we're going to see what other things affect classical conditioning and how well, how long, how easily you learn these different associations. So last time we introduced the idea of people being afraid of spiders. So today we're going to take a look at how you might treat somebody. What does classical conditioning have to say about how you might treat somebody who was afraid of spiders? So somebody was deathly afraid of spiders and it started to affect their lives because they just landed this dream job. But in that dream job, it's in a office building where there's a spider lab, on the second floor, and now they're too afraid to go to work. If it's something like that and they need to get rid of that fear of spiders, what does classical conditioning tell us about how that can be done? And then we're also going to apply classical conditioning to help explain another fear, which is the fear of clowns, also known as coulrophobia. So this will help to explain how people develop coulrophobia, the actual debilitating fear of clowns. But also why many people, while they're not afraid of clowns, just have a little bit of an uneasy experience, an uneasy feeling towards them. So clowns, for many people, are an aversive stimulus, something that they would rather avoid. Again, you might not be afraid of it, but it could be an aversive stimulus. So again, we'll see how does that aversive stimulus develop, and what does classical conditioning tell us about why that occurs. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to start with a look at extinction, spontaneous recovery, and disinhibition. Then we're going to take a look at stimulus generalization and discrimination. But just real quick, before we do that, just remembering something here. Oops. I did want to mention something about the upcoming Sniffy assignments. Okay, yeah. So just because some students have been asking, we are going to go over next class what I expect for the first 3 Sniffy assignments. So those first 3 Sniffy assignments are going to be due a week from today. So number 1, basic acquisition of a CR. Number 2, extinction. Number 3, spontaneous recovery. We're going to talk about those things, those concepts a little bit today. And then next class, I will actually say, this is what Sniffy looks like. This is what you'll be doing. And this is the output that I'm looking for, just so that on these first ones, it's going to be very straightforward for you to do the Sniffy assignments. In terms of the time that it will take you, I chose these first 3 because they're very straightforward. So in total, to complete all 3 of those, if you have Sniffy installed and it's working, in total to complete all 3 of those, you can easily, very comfortably get it done in under half an hour. So it's not a lot of work. Most of you will probably get it done in much less time. But we're going to go over exactly what I'm looking for in next class. But also, now is your time, if you haven't already, make sure Sniffy is installed on whatever computer you're going to be using. Make sure it's up and running. So just double click on it. You should see it pop open. You should see a little white rat running around. And if it's not working, please, go to the IT center here and do what you need to do to get that going. All right, now back to our regularly scheduled programming. We are going to, again, look at some of these complexities of and phenomenon in classical conditioning. So just a basic recap of what classical conditioning is. In classical conditioning, you have an unconditioned stimulus, and that unconditioned stimulus causes an unconditioned response. So before conditioning, before any learning has occurred whatsoever for this particular dog, food is an unconditioned stimulus. And we know that because food will cause the target behavior, which is salivation, which is the unconditioned response. So if you give a dog food without learning anything, that dog will start to salivate. Food causes salivation. The unconditioned stimulus causes the unconditioned response. And also, before conditioning, you have a neutral stimulus, which in this case is a bell. And the neutral stimulus does not cause any target behavior. So it will not cause salivation. It might cause other behaviors. I'd be very surprised if you rang a bell and a dog didn't look for the source of the sound, but it doesn't cause the target behavior that we're looking for, in this case, salivation. So the bell does not cause, or causes no salivation. The bell is a neutral stimulus. And what we do in classical conditioning is we pair that neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus. So you present the neutral stimulus, you follow that by the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus, and in the early stages, the unconditioned stimulus is causing the unconditioned response. So you present the neutral stimulus, the bell, you ring the bell, you then give the dog the food, the unconditioned stimulus, and that food is causing that unconditioned response. And you do this over and over and over and over again, and through learning, what happens is that bell changes from a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus. So that's the learning that occurs in classical conditioning. That's the conditioning. You change your neutral stimulus into a conditioned stimulus. And we can test whether learning has occurred by presenting the conditioned stimulus alone. And if we present that conditioned stimulus alone and it now causes a response, in this case it causes salivation, the conditioned response, we know that that neutral stimulus is transformed into a conditioned stimulus. So before we go on to any of the new stuff today, any questions on classical conditioning, its basic format? All right. So how can we use this if somebody comes in and is afraid of spiders? So oftentimes phobias develop as a result of classical conditioning. So you have a spider, which might be a neutral stimulus. Early on, you pair that with an unconditioned stimulus that causes fear. Eventually, that spider turns into a conditioned stimulus that also causes fear. And now you don't want to experience that fear anymore. You don't want that fear when you see that conditioned stimulus of the spider. So what could you do if you were a therapist and in walked a person and said, I got to get rid of my fear of spiders. Can you help me? How would you help that individual? Well, one basic procedure is to take them through a process known as extinction. And extinction, when applied to classical conditioning, is where a conditioned response is either weakened and or eliminated by repeatedly presenting the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus. All right, so I'll mention that again. You get rid of the conditioned response, which is what we want to get rid of. We want to get rid of that conditioned response by repeatedly presenting the conditioned stimulus, but no longer pairing it with the unconditioned stimulus. So that's the procedure of extinction. And the procedure that achieves this effect of extinction is also called extinction. So you can say, oh, I went through extinction, and now my CS has achieved extinction, right? So it's used for both cases, but this is what you do in order to undo the learning, that occurred. So, for example, let's say that you trained this dog here that every time you ring that bell, the dog starts salivating. The bell is a conditioned stimulus or has changed into a conditioned stimulus. The salivation is a conditioned response. Now let's say that you think to yourself, you know what, I want to take this dog home, but I don't want it drooling all over the carpet every single time somebody rings the doorbell. What can I do? Well, you can go through extinction. And what extinction is you just continually present, or multiple times, you present that bell with no food. That's the key to extinction. You present the conditioned stimulus, but you do not present the unconditioned stimulus. So you would ring that bell, no food. You would ring that bell again, no food. You would ring that bell again, no food. And you would continue doing this. And what would happen is that the strength of the salivation would go lower and lower and lower every single time that conditioned stimulus was presented without the unconditioned stimulus, without the food, until eventually you would ring that bell and there would be no salivation. So that is the end point of extinction, where the bell has gone back to, and I put this in quotes, gone back to a neutral stimulus. Now the reason I put that in quotes is that it's a neutral stimulus because it no longer elicits the target behavior, right? So we've gotten this down to the point where if you ring that bell, the dog no longer salivates. So we've gotten it to that point, it's a neutral stimulus. However, it's important to realize that it's very difficult to unlearn something that you've learned. And that neutral stimulus is not the same as it was before. So even though you ring the bell and that dog no longer salivates, that bell ringing, that neutral stimulus has hidden properties. It's got little secret characteristics to it that make it different than the bell when it was first a neutral stimulus. All right, but importantly though, in terms of extinction, we've taken this bell and we've changed it from a neutral stimulus all the way, changed it from a conditioned stimulus all the way back to a neutral stimulus. So this is the procedure that you would use if you were treating somebody for their fear of spiders. So you would, and this is one of the difficult things about treatment, because they need to go through the conditioned response, you would present them with either a spider, maybe a rubber spider, if you want, and we'll talk about shaping later on, but you would present them basically in its core sense. You would present them with their conditioned stimulus. You would present them with something that they're afraid of. You would present them with a spider. And you might say, well, here's this spider. There it is on your hand. And they would be like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, I am terrified. And you take the spider away, and you'd be like, guess what? Here's a spider again in your hand. Oh my gosh, I'm terrified I'm going to get bitten. You make sure that they don't get bitten, right? You make sure that this spider is not paired with the unconditioned stimulus of pain, which causes the unconditioned response of fear, and you would keep putting that in their hand, putting that in their hand, putting that in their hand, and eventually they get to the point where they're like, okay, I'm doing okay now. And if they needed to, theoretically, you could get it to the point where they're like, oh, look at that cute little spider, right? You got rid of their conditioned response. So that's what we're doing in extinction, changing that conditioned response, basically reversing it and changing it into a neutral stimulus that no longer elicits that behavior. But importantly, and this is one of the complexities, not the same as the neutral stimulus was before. So what are some of these things that are not the same? Well, one of the things that occurs, one of the things that changes this neutral stimulus so that it's not the same as it is before, one of these kind of like hidden characteristics of this extinction neutral stimulus occurs when you simply take a break. So let's say that we went through this entire process and we got this dog down to the point where you ring the bell and nothing happens, right? Ring the bell, no salivation. Ring the bell again, no salivation. Ring the bell again, no salivation. We're like, congratulations, we went through extinction. Let's say that we then take this dog home, and that dog spends a night in our place, a night just taking a break, a night outside of the lab, and we bring that dog back into the lab the next day, and we ring that bell. That same bell that we spent all of the previous day turning back into a neutral stimulus, and we ring that bell, and what's going to happen? That dog will start salivating. So we didn't present the bell with food. We didn't do that. All we did was give that dog a break, take him outside of the lab, but as soon as we bring him back, that neutral stimulus that we achieved yesterday, after the break, boom, goes back to being a conditioned stimulus. And we know this because it is now causing the conditioned response that dog is salivating all over again. So this is a phenomenon. It's a little insidious phenomenon, and you'll see why in just a second. But this is a phenomenon known as spontaneous recovery. And it's kind of there in the name. The conditioned response was recovered, and it was spontaneous after a period of rest. So again, we went through the entire process of extinction. We got to the point where we ring that bell and the dog's not salivating. The bell was never again paired with food. So it's not like we put it through another trial of classical conditioning. The bell was never paired with food. All we did was take the dog home, give the dog a break from the lab. As soon as we bring him back into the lab, ring that bell, boom, the salivation comes back. And that is spontaneous recovery. And this, I mentioned, was insidious. This is one of the biggest obstacles when people try to change their behavior, when people try to get rid of, for example, phobias. Because this spontaneous recovery means that you can recover your phobia, you can recover that conditioned response of fear by doing nothing else than taking a break. So if we take a look here, this is what spontaneous recovery and extinction would look like, in a typical treatment setting. So we have here the strength of the conditioned response. You can think of that as the amount of fear that a person is experiencing. Let's say that this is our spider client. That's the amount of fear that they experience when they're in contact with the spider. And this is day one, right? This is day one as they walk into your treatment center. And you're like, all right, let me give you that spider. There you go, spider in your hand. It's not going to bite. You're not going to feel any pain. It's a conditioned stimulus. And they would experience a tremendous amount of fear. So you do it again. Spider in your hand. Tremendous amount of fear, but a little bit less. You do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again. And as your trials go more and more and more and more and more, the strength of that conditioned response goes lower, 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 until, hypothetically, let's say, you get to the end point here, and you put that in their hand, and they're like, oh, okay, I'm feeling fine. Like, I'm not experiencing any fear. And you're like, wonderful, we've gone through extinction. What can happen is they might go home that night, and they might have a good rest, and they might sleep on it, and they might be like, oh, thank goodness, the extinction procedure worked. And the next morning, they wake up, and they see a spider in their kitchen, and they freak out, and all the fear comes back. Not all of it, a lot of the fear comes back. And what's happening to them is they're going through spontaneous recovery. So this is one of the big hurdles, because if you don't have a therapist that warns a client about this, if you don't have a therapist that tells the client what their recovery is going to be like, their first thought is going to be like, this therapy doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. I'm still afraid of spiders. And it is true, they're still afraid of spiders, but you can see not quite as much as before. So this is why getting rid of a phobia is a long process. It's a lot of work, because that client has to come back to that therapist. And in fact, a therapist would say, okay, where are we at the end of session 1? You have the spider in your hand and you're not freaking out. And the person's like, yes, I'm cured. And the therapist would say, no, you're not. Come back tomorrow or come back next week. We got to work on this a little bit more. Because as soon as you do that rest and you see that spider again, your fear, your conditioned response will be spontaneously recovered. So you got to come back. Here's the spider. Oh my gosh, I'm freaking out. Here's the spider, a little bit less fear. Here's the spider, still a little angsty. Until, here's the spider, totally fine. I'm great, I'm cured. No, you're not. Come back a third time, because we're going to have to do this again, and again, and again, until finally you're going to have a session where you begin with, here's a spider, and they're like, yeah, I'm cool, I'm totally fine. So this spontaneous recovery is one of the big challenges, because it literally looks like your therapy, all that effort that this client is putting in there is not working at all, but it's a process. And unfortunately, for phobias, spontaneous recovery is just one of the characteristics of classical conditioning. Any questions on spontaneous recovery? All right. So what else can happen with classical conditioning? What else can happen with extinction? So let's say, once again, we're going through extinction. We want this dog to no longer salivate when the bell is rung. The bell is a conditioned stimulus. Salivation is a conditioned response. We keep ringing the bell with no food. Procedure of extinction. Present the conditioned stimulus. The bell. Do not present the unconditioned stimulus to food. And the conditioned response will go down, 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 until, once again, that bell reaches neutral stimulus territory. But again, it's no longer eliciting the target behavior, which is the definition of a neutral stimulus, but it's not the same neutral stimulus as it was before. So how do we know this? Well, spontaneous recovery is one piece of evidence that it's not the same neutral stimulus as it was before. And another piece of evidence is what happens when some new stimulus occurs. So even, let's say that we never left the lab. We've been ringing that bell, no food. Ringing that bell, no food. Ringing that bell, no food. And we finally get it to the point where we ring that bell and the dog is not salivating whatsoever. If at that point somebody introduces a new stimulus, like a clicking noise, if at that point somebody is just like, oh, I made this breakthrough, right? That stimulus on its own, that clicking noise, might cause the bell to once again cause salivation. So that clicking noise has taken that neutral stimulus and changed it back into a conditioned stimulus that now causes a conditioned response, and that is known as disinhibition. So disinhibition is where you get a sudden recovery of that conditioned response during the extinction procedure, right? So it's not spontaneous recovery. We didn't take a break, but we get that recovery when a novel stimulus is introduced. So just that new clicking sound can be enough to take that bell that became a neutral stimulus through extinction and bring it right back to being a conditioned stimulus. And this is, once again, one of the reasons why if you are doing therapy with a client and you book an appointment time, oftentimes therapists will say things like, I'm not to be interrupted, no phone calls, do not knock on my door, I have this client from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock, I am not to be interrupted, because you could be working hard. Spider, ooh, totally afraid. Spider, ooh, feeling a little bit better. Spider, getting there. Spider, oh, I feel great. Knock on the door. Spider, back to conditioned reactions, back to conditioned response. So this disinhibition, again, is one of these complexities in classical conditioning. And again, it's just a novel stimulus gets introduced, and that conditioned stimulus pops right back up, and it causes that conditioned response. All right, so those are two of the complexities for classical conditioning. Any questions about spontaneous recovery or disinhibition before we move on to the next concept? Okay, so just a little bit of foreshadowing. You will do classical conditioning on your first SNFI assignment. So you will classically condition a fear response in SNFI. For assignment number 2, you'll go through the process of extinction to get rid of that particular fear response. And then in exercise number 3, you'll go through spontaneous recovery, and you'll literally see that fear response come back up. So we'll have more details about that next time we meet, so you know exactly what you're doing. But that is what we're going to be doing for the first 3 SNFI assignments. All right, back to clowns, back to coulrophobia. So the fear of clowns, there's a few theories about the fear of clowns, and it really is like an interesting kind of paradox, right? I mean, here we have this children's, icon, birthday party, entertainer designed to bring children joy, and yet for some reason, a lot of people have aversive reactions to clowns. They make them feel uneasy, they feel a little bit of fear, not to the point where they have to leave a birthday party if a clown comes out, but some people have that extreme reaction, but a lot of people kind of just feel a little bit like, ooh, it's like there's a clown. It's like I'm gonna, go over here, and I'm not enjoying this. So why does this occur? There's a number of different theories. One of the ones that, one of the leading theories has to do with the portrayal of clowns in our popular media, specifically the trope of the scary clown. So that is one of the leading explanations, and it's a very straightforward explanation. You're afraid of clowns because you've seen killer clowns over and over and over again. So we just had a huge hit with the horror movie It, ruining birthday parties for generations to come. And, clearly, I mean, if you've seen this, no surprise that you're going to be a little angsty the next time you see a clown. If you haven't seen It, it's amazing how many kind of bad or scary clowns pop up in popular culture. So one of my first experiences when I was a little kid with the bad clowns that really I was like angry and disturbed about it was Dumbo. I hated the clowns in Dumbo. They were like the meanest people. Has everybody here seen Dumbo? Yeah. Basically endangering this poor defenseless elephant, throwing him out of a 50-story building, and then later on, just poking fun at him, later on talking about how they should drop him out of 100 stories. No, make it 200. How about 1,000? The twice as high is twice the less. I mean, they're horrible people. And, this is a children's film. So in a lot of children's media, there is this, or just a lot of media in general, there is this trope of the, the evil clown. So I got one last one, two more kind of examples. One from a more recent film. So if you guys are not aware of the awesomeness that is Teen Titans Go, I highly recommend it. It's one of the shows that my daughter absolutely loves. But here we have Starfire, and we're going to see her reaction to clowns.
You know what, Titans? After saving the world, I think we've earned ourselves a party. All right! We'll have food, dancing, and any type of entertainment you guys want. A DJ, rock band, magician, you name it. A clown! What? You said a clown!
Please, what is the clown?
This is a clown, Star.
All right, so again, the idea of the super scary clown, and we're going to see later on when we talk about observational learning why that might be particularly effective in making a child afraid of clowns. So the examples are numerous in Inside Out. You got Jangles, the gigantic sized rampaging clown that is dangerous. So there is that one theory that a lot of people develop this fear towards clowns, or this aversive stimulus status for clowns, just because of their portrayal in a lot of popular media. The evil clown, again, is a trope. But there's another explanation. There's more to this than just this exposure, because this, even if you haven't seen these examples, even if you've never seen, examples of killer clowns, you might still have this fear of clowns. So what's another explanation for why this fear of clowns can occur? Well, it has to do with another basic property of classical conditioning. So we'll start off with the kind of textbook version of this, and then we'll take a look at how this applies to developing this phobia for clowns, basically taking clowns from a neutral stimulus to being a conditioned stimulus that causes a conditioned response, namely fear. All right, so let's say, once again, we have our basic conditioning. You're ringing a bell, you pair with food, food causes salivation, the bell becomes a conditioned stimulus after conditioning, the food, always the unconditioned stimulus, the salivation is the unconditioned response. So we know that the bell is a conditioned stimulus because after conditioning, if you ring that bell, it causes salivation all on its own. The bell, the conditioned stimulus, causes salivation, the conditioned response. But now we're going to see that that bell that you've rung that whole time, it's not the only bell right now that will cause that conditioned response. So you remember I alluded to this before when I said you take that dog home and you don't want it salivating when the doorbell rings. Well, the reason that that might occur is because that bell is not the only bell now that will cause the conditioned response of salivation. So let's say that that bell was a 2000 hertz bell. So you have a bell and it's like ding, 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 and that bell causes salivation. Let's say that that was the bell that the dog was trained with. That was the original bell that was used during classical conditioning. If you then take a completely new bell, but it has a lower tone, let's say it's only a 1900 hertz bell, ding, 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 that bell will also cause salivation. So the dog has never heard this bell before, never trained on that bell, and yet it's not a neutral stimulus, it's a conditioned stimulus, it's causing salivation, the conditioned response. And if you ring a higher bell, ding, 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 that'll also cause the salivation. So again, we have this case where two bells that the dog has never heard, that have never been paired with food, all of a sudden are causing a conditioned response, indicating that they're now a conditioned stimulus. So this phenomenon is known as stimulus generalization. And what we have in stimulus generalization is when a conditioned response occurs in the presence of stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimulus. So the conditioned stimulus is what the dog was trained with. It used to be a neutral stimulus. It got paired with the unconditioned stimulus. It's now a conditioned stimulus. And stimulus generalization refers to the phenomenon where stimuli that are like the conditioned stimulus will now also elicit the conditioned response. So this is a stimulus generalization curve. So on the y-axis here, we have conditioned response strength. So this is how strong the conditioned response is. So you can think of this as how many milliliters of saliva did the dog salivate. This is the conditioned stimulus. This is what the organism was trained on. This is what the organism was classically conditioned with. And then what we have on this x-axis is we have increasing difference going in both directions, right? So if it is a sound like a 2000 hertz tone or a 2000 hertz bell, this is the stimulus that the dog was trained on, and it leads to the largest conditioned response. So the strongest conditioned response is going to be in reaction to the conditioned stimulus that was used during training. However, other stimuli that are like that conditioned stimulus will also cause a conditioned response. So even though this was never paired with food, and even though this was never paired with food, when you ring them, they'll still cause salivation. To a lesser degree, but they'll still cause salivation. So that is stimulus generalization. Basically, you generalize across different stimuli because they're like the original stimulus that you got trained on. Any questions so far on the basic idea? So if anybody's interested in animal psychology, if you're ever interested in understanding the behavior of animals, the cognition of animals, stimulus generalization is actually a great tool that you can use to kind of test what an animal is thinking or how an animal thinks. So one way that you can use it, let's say that you wanted to know whether or not an animal categorizes colors the same way that we do, right? We want to know if an animal categorizes colors. Does an animal think that red is different from blue, whereas purple is close to blue, right? Do animals think that same way? Well, you can't just walk up to an animal and say, what do you think? Are these two closer together or are these two closer together? We don't have that capability. But what we can do is we can train an animal. For example, let's go back to, well, not the dogs, they're colorblind. Let's say that we had orangutans, right? And we trained these orangutans to salivate when we presented a blue square. So we present a blue square, here's some food. Here's a blue square, here's some food. Here's a blue square, here's some food. And eventually we get it to the point where they are salivating to a blue square. What we can then do is then we can show them different colors. And based upon how much they salivate to those new colors, we can tell how much they think this new color is similar to this color. So if we show them purple and they salivate more than they do when we show them red, that's our way of knowing that in their mind, they're categorizing purple as being closer to blue and red as being further away from blue. So it's a very good tool that you can use to see how animals categorize and think about different concepts. So you could do the same thing with shapes. Let's say that we had birds and we wanted to know how does a bird think about shapes. We can train them to, I don't know if birds salivate. We can train them to have some conditioned response to the blue square, and then show them a triangle, show them a pentagon, show them a hexagon, and see what their reactions are to those. And we can see by the reduction in the conditioned response whether or not they think that these are similar. So if an animal has a conception of shapes, this might be the conditioned responses that we get if they understand that, oh, this is a shape, and this one is kind of like this one, but this one is less like this one. If that's their understanding of shapes, that's the conditioned response curve, the stimulus generalization curve we would see. Or if this animal has no conception of shapes and doesn't think that either of these are like each other, we would see a reaction that looked like this, where they would still salivate when we show them the square, but as soon as we show them the triangle, if they didn't salivate, they'd be basically telling us, that has nothing to do with this. This is a completely new thing that I do not associate with this whatsoever. So again, it's a very powerful tool, especially if you're dealing with organisms that cannot communicate like animals, maybe very small children. You can still use this stimulus generalization tool to get at how are they thinking, what is it that, how do they conceptualize these different stimuli. All right, so that's stimulus generalization. So we are now going to use that concept to help explain why people might be afraid of clowns, even if they have never encountered that evil clown trope, even if they have never had a bad experience at a birthday party, even if they've never turned around and the clown went boo, and they were like, ah, right? Even if none of that ever happened, if they've never had a bad experience with a clown, we can actually take it all the way back. If they do not know what a clown is, why would they still possibly be afraid of this particular clown? So for this last part of this lecture, I was going to say the last part of this lecture is going to be R-rated. We're going to be talking about horror films. So if that really isn't your jam, avert your eyes. But basically, one of the reasons why people develop fear towards clowns has to do with other things that they've been conditioned to fear. So if you are a fan of horror films, particularly of the slasher variety, you probably know who that is. Does anybody not know? All right, so that's Jason Voorhees. He's from the Friday the 13th film series. And we're going to see later how horror films use classical conditioning and observational learning in order to make you fear this particular individual. So let's say that you didn't even see the machete, right? Let's say that the machete wasn't there. And you saw somebody like this walking down the street. He would probably be a pretty neutral stimulus, right? You look at him and you're like, maybe he's on the way to a hockey game or a hockey match, maybe, he's not very well dressed. Maybe he was, doing some landscaping and didn't want stuff flying into his face. You'd probably be pretty neutral to him. After you watch the films, you're no longer neutral to him. And you see that hockey mask and you better start running because, again, of pairing classical conditioning, pairing this neutral stimulus with murders and, basically murders, with murders that which are the unconditioned stimulus that cause the unconditioned response of fear. And eventually you see the mask and you're like, ooh, I know to be afraid of this person. So they do that with horror movie icons. So we got Jason here, we got Mike Myers here, and again, you know, this one's a little bit just straight up creepier. But really, I mean, it's just the guy in a mask. But then after repeatedly seeing him take out and dispatch victim after victim, that mask gets paired with an unconditioned stimulus of watching this violence. That unconditioned stimulus causes fear, and eventually you start to be afraid of just the face. And this is done in movie after movie. So Scream was another classic one from I believe the 20th century, back in the 1900s. Anyways, if you want more modern examples of these, same thing occurs with Annabelle creation. So really, I mean, you have here a doll that shouldn't be that creepy, and yet after you watch the film, yes, that doll will be creepy. And then they do the same thing with other ones in the Conjuring universe. So here we have the Nun, and this one is more of an unconditioned stimulus. I mean, you see those teeth, you're going to start running. But notice that a lot of these horror movie icons kind of have this similar structure to their faces, right? So we got Jason here, and notice he's got white all over his face, darkness around the eyes, a little bit of red near the top. Mike Myers has got white all around his face. Ghostface Killer has got white all around his face, darkness around the eyes. Annabelle, very white face, red lips, red cheeks, darkness around the eyes. We got the new horror movie now that's doing very well, The Nun. Notice again, very white face, redness around the mouth in this case. So all of these movies are designed to make you fear these individuals. It's designed to give you that experience. That's why we go to horror movies, because you're like, oh my gosh, that was the scariest horror movie ever. It was amazing. But again, notice that a lot of them have this kind of pale face, dark eyes, pale face, dark eyes with redness, pale face, dark eyes with a little bit of redness. And where have we seen this pale face, dark eyes with a little bit of redness before? That's right, in just about every single clown. So what happens, or what oftentimes happens, when people develop aversive reactions towards clowns is because they've experienced classical conditioning to images like this, right? Classical conditioning to images like this. And basically, this face is a stimulus. And if this face as a stimulus is at all similar to that face as a stimulus, you're going to go through stimulus generalization, and you're going to feel fear towards this stimulus. So again, notice the parallels. We got white face. We got white face. We got darkness around the eyes. We got darkness around the eyes. We have redness around the mouth. We got redness around the mouth. And the similarities between these means that you're going to get your biggest conditioned response to this stimulus, the one that you learned to fear because you went to the movie and you had that experience, and now you've been conditioned to fear this particular stimulus. But through stimulus generalization, you're going to feel fear when you look at this stimulus because of the similarity between the two faces. And, you know, conceptually, they're completely different. You know, like clowns and monsters, two different things. But your brain picks up on those similarities, and you don't have a stronger response, but you do have a conditioned response of fear. And that's why when you see images like that or clowns like this, you might have that kind of like, well, I don't feel like running, but I'd rather not, you know, this isn't, I don't feel good about this particular clown. All right, so that's one of the other explanations of chorophobia. It's stimulus generalization, where other stimuli that have the same kind of features as the clown face, you're conditioned to fear them, and then through stimulus generalization, you end up fearing the clown. All right, any questions on that? Make sense? All right, so the last thing we're going to take a look is an explanation about why children might be afraid of clowns. So hopefully children are not watching, you know, The Nun, right? Hopefully parents are using that R rating and saying, you know what, maybe when you're a little bit older, you can watch The Nun. But we still have children who will be afraid of clowns. And again, they might never have seen a clown before. This might be the first birthday party they're going to, where they're encountering this thing we call a clown, and yet they're still kind of like, ooh, no, 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 I don't want, I don't want to be near that clown. Aversive stimulus, trying to get away from it. So how could we possibly explain when people fear clowns if they've never seen a horror movie in their life? So the rest of this is going to be presented for general audiences. So even if you've never seen horror movies before, even if you've never had that condition, this stimulus turned into a conditioned stimulus that causes fear, you have encountered other clown-like things that have caused fear in you as a child. And a lot of this can be placed firmly at Disney's doorstep. So, Maleficent, right? One of the most iconic, probably the most iconic Disney villain of all time. Came from Sleeping Beauty, a movie that children would watch over and over and over again. And notice, what does she have? Pale face, darkness around the eyes, redness around the lips, right? Something that a child would watch, something that a child is conditioned to fear in this movie, at a G level rating, but still, when you're a child, pretty scary villain, and once again, has those features that a clown has. So if you're conditioned to fear Maleficent because of the things that she does in the movie, all of a sudden you might have that stimulus generalization where you are now going to feel fear when you see a clown. So it's not just Maleficent. Here we got Ursula from The Little Mermaid. And once again, notice what she has. Pale face, darkness around the eyes, super red lips. Here's the Queen from Snow White. Once again, pale face, darkness around the eyes, ruby red lips. These Disney villainesses do not know how to do their makeup. It's just way too much. And they're literally like, it's almost every single villain will have this. So here we have, I forgot her name from The Rescuers. Let's see if we got it. No. So we have, this is from The Rescuers. And I remember she kidnapped Penny. And she is probably the most realistic villain, I think, in all of Disney. So she's not a sorceress. She's just a woman who kidnapped a child to try to reach a treasure. And but again, you have this pale face, darkness around the eyes, ruby red lips. And we're going to see later when we talk about observational learning why Disney intently made her very depowered. She wasn't much of a threat in the end of things. And one of the reasons was because the protagonist, the girl, was one of the youngest protagonists that they had. And when we talk about observational learning, we'll see why that was an important consideration. But, the list goes on. Cruella de Vil, once again, pale face, darkness around the eyes, ruby red lips. And she, is a source of fear in that movie. So, again, if you've never seen a horror film and you walk into a birthday party and you see a clown and you're like, no, not so much. It could be because of this stimulus generalization. So, side by side, it's the same pose. It's almost the same everything. And again, if you are conditioned to fear this individual because you watch the movies, and that's what good movies will do. They'll condition you to have a response so that you can have that emotional response to the movie. If you're conditioned to fear this stimulus, any similarities between those two stimuli will cause stimulus generalization, where you will then feel fear when you see this particular stimulus. So again, if you've never seen a clown before, never had a bad reaction to a clown, never watched a horror movie, totally new stimulus to you, but you've seen Cruella de Vil and Ursula and Maleficent and the Queen, then you might have, again, a fearful reaction, a conditioned response to this clown here because of that similarity, because of that stimulus generalization. All right, so any questions on that explanation of the aversive feelings towards clowns? Make sense? Is anybody here thinking about their own aversive feelings towards clowns and going, why did I watch Sleeping Beauty so often when I was a kid, or anything else? So yeah, go as you go through media now. You're going to see a lot of the killer clown trope, right? So It is starting to film its new thing. There'll be trailers pretty soon. But keep your eye open for characters that you are supposed to fear, characters that are supposed to be scary, and just make a mental note and see how often they do have those features of a clown. Pale face, darkness around the eyes, maybe super red lips, and just see how often that occurs. And you'd be surprised. I mean, when I started looking at this in the Disney films, I'm like, wow, like every single film basically has this kind of a facial structure. And just, take a look at other instances of it, and you can see how we could be conditioned over and over and over and over again to fear that stimulus, and then that just generalizes right over to that clown face. So again, stimulus generalization, very basic premise, and again, a very kind of basic idea about why we might fear these clowns. All right, so the last thing we're going to do today is, what do you do if somebody does have a fear of clowns, right? What do you do if somebody did develop this this irrational, let's face it, fear of clowns, and it's due to stimulus generalization? How can you get rid of that particular effect? So much like with the extinction procedure, we're going to see that you can unlearn stimulus generalization. So let's say that we trained our dog to salivate to that 2,000 hertz tone. All right, so this is actually, let's say that we're starting off with a fresh dog, and this is before conditioning. So there's a 2,000 hertz tone, it's a neutral stimulus, 2,000 hertz bell. You pair that with food, the unconditioned stimulus, it causes salivation, the unconditioned response. That's part of his training. If we do not want this dog to generalize that bell to other stimuli, what we can do is we can also, at random intervals, present a different bell, a lower bell, a 1900 hertz bell, which is a neutral stimulus, but never give the dog food. So 2000 hertz bell, ding, 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 here's some food. 1900 hertz bell, ding, 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 no food. And we do this over and over and over again. And what we'll find is that after conditioning, that 2000 hertz bell has become a conditioned stimulus, an excitatory conditioned stimulus is what they call it. That's that CS plus for excitatory. That causes salivation, the conditioned response. So this is your typical classical conditioning. However, we have stopped that stimulus generalization, and this dog will learn not to salivate to the 1900 hertz bell, the conditioned stimulus for inhibition. So this procedure where you reward or where you pair food with one bell, but you don't pair food with the other bell, and that leads to one bell being a conditioned stimulus that causes the conditioned response, and the other bell not to cause that conditioned response. This is known as stimulus discrimination. So this is another tool that scientists will use to study the abilities of animals or other nonverbal organisms by seeing what can they tell the difference between. So literally, can they discriminate between these two stimuli? Well, if they can, then we'll see the tendency for the conditioned response to be elicited more by one, conditioned stimulus, the excitatory stimulus, rather than the other, in this case, that inhibitory conditioned stimulus. So if we were to do this procedure, this stimulus discrimination, again, 2000 hertz tone paired with food, 1900 hertz tone not paired with food, basically what would happen is instead of that stimulus generalization curve where the dog would generalize and respond to that 1900 hertz tone, what we would get in this case is a generalization curve or a discrimination curve that looked more like that. So we would have no response to 1900 hertz tones. We would still have the highest response to the 2000 hertz tones, and again, it would decrease going this other way. But importantly, we've trained the organism to discriminate between the 1900 hertz and the 2000 hertz tone. So two things: we know that this dog can tell the difference between these two tones, because if they couldn't discriminate between those, they wouldn't have different reactions. The second thing is that they learned that this does not result in food, so there's no need to salivate, but this does, so they should salivate. They have that conditioned response. And this would be a treatment option for somebody that was afraid of clowns, had an uneasy feeling about them. We might continually pair clowns with no fear, clowns with nothing bad happening, and if they wanted to watch horror movies, we would just tell them, avoid it, avoid all the scary clowns, but go see The Nun, go see Annabelle, go see The Purge, go see the Friday the 13th movies, because you can still have that conditioned fear response to these horror movies, but through stimulus discrimination, here's a clown, look, nothing bad is happening. Here's a clown, look, they're not murdering anybody. Here's a clown, look, they're totally fine. Here's a clown with no unconditioned stimulus that's going to cause the unconditioned response of fear. They can learn to discriminate between the two. So they can still enjoy their horror movies and their Disney films, but not have that adverse reaction to clowns. All right, any final thoughts, questions, comments? All right, so that's it for today's class. So remember, we started Chapter 4 today, but next class we are having our Chapter 4 pretest. So definitely read the book, read the chapter, get ready for that. And I will see you next week.